back. So my apologies for a little extended departure there. I think some of you may know, though, that one of our consistent members here, Dave Farrell, passed away last week. I can tell you, I was down in Santa Cruz to be with him and his family, and it was a profoundly tranquil and peaceful death, and very grateful to him. His family gifted me the copy of Contemplating Christ that he had been using, and all of his marks throughout these sessions are there, and the dates in which we were covering the various paragraphs are there. So I've been treasuring that as I've looked back on the kind of comments and highlights he made throughout the book. So it's a bit of a treasure there. So we hold Dave and his family in our prayer this morning as we move into our session together. So let me call up, if I can, our share screen for the day, and that should be available now. So welcome back, and as always, Benum Christ in it. I greet Christ in you. It's good to see you all here. Let us pray. This is a prayer that I've taken from Howard Thurman, Meditations of the Heart. O Lord, I want to be more loving. Often there are good and sufficient reasons for exercising what seems a clean, direct resentment. Again and again, I find it hard to hold in check the sharp retort, the biting comeback, when it seems that someone has done violence to my self, respect, and decent regard. How natural it seems to give as good as I get, to take nothing lying down, to announce to all and every in 1,000 ways that no one can run over me and get away with it. I want to be more loving in my heart. Amen. So the reading today is bringing us very close to the end of this chapter. The first one is on page 127, begins a new section. And this is one of 3 concluding sections in which I explore all of these sort of conceptual ideas around contemplative practice and asceticism in more concrete ways. And this first subsection, entitled Other People, looks at an ascesis of personal love. So how does asceticism come into play with relationship to the people I know and love in my own life? Hell is other people, or so maintains the French playwright and philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre through one of his characters, Joseph Garcin, in No Exit. While this sentiment is, as it is popularly understood, may often ring true experientially, a more optimistic Christian view would contend asceticism is other people. That is to say, the darker aspects of ourselves we are forced to confront through our relationships with others do not present hopeless roadblocks to our spiritual development, but a vocational call to love ourselves and others more authentically. For Christian contemplatives, this call to love is both the foundation and summit of Christian ascesis, because it is likewise the foundation and summit of the whole Christian life. The British Carmelite Ruth Burroughs wrote, "In true love for our neighbor lies all the asceticism we need. Here is the way we die to self. What are the disciplines, artificial practices of penance and humility, compared with this relentless pursuit of love? Perfect love of the neighbor means complete death to the self and the triumph of the life of Jesus in us." So our second reading this morning will span 127 to 128. The most challenging forms of ascesis are not the ones we choose, but the ones that are thrust on us through life circumstances, especially when involving our relationships with other people. Modern suburban life presents any number of interactions or situations that may be interpreted either as roadblocks or as invitations to love, depending on our ascetical posture. Commonplace experiences we have come to accept as necessary evils of modern day life are in fact schools of love. Long lines, crowded subways, heavy traffic, fractured families, hostile neighbors, dysfunctional workplaces, and so on. If we perpetually experience these things as personal assaults or affronts to our inner peace, then we will never find the interior stillness we seek. As Burroughs suggests, artificial practices of penance must give way to more nimble forms of ascesis that have as their basis the relentless pursuit of love. These need not be heroic acts of grandiosity, but may well be the moment-by-moment accumulation of a secret generosity toward others. As Jesus poetically admonished, even the left hand need not know what the right hand is doing. And let us pray. Again, taken from the same portion of Thurman's book, Meditations of the Heart. I want to be more loving in my heart. It is often easy to have the idea in mind to plan to be more loving, to see it with the mind and give assent to it, to the thought of being loving. This is crystal clear. But I want to be more loving in my heart. I must feel like loving. I must ease the tension in my heart that ejects the sharp barb, the stinging word. I want to be more loving in my heart, that with unconscious awareness and deliberate intent, I shall be a kind, a gracious human being. Thus, those who walk the path with me may find it easier to be loving, to be gracious, because of the love of God, which is increasingly expressed in my living. I want to be more loving in my heart. Amen. So once again, welcome back. And as always, we can take a few moments in silence. And I'm open to your comments or reflections or questions that we might explore together this morning. Good morning, Mary Sue. Go right ahead.
Good morning. I think it's more coming from Howard Thurman's prayer, but also I think from what this section of your book, the idea that we don't have to go out of our way to look for ways to become closer to God. You know, I have often been challenged by my spiritual directors not to work so hard. And what I am coming to understand is that all I have to do is be present to what's going on in my life. The opportunities are there. So that's one thing that comes to mind. The other one is that being loving in your heart, you know, sometimes you can do the right thing, but your heart is, you know, but but the feeling center, the emotional center, isn't in line with your actions. So you have the ability to recognize that I'm not feeling very loving, but I can act loving anyway. Does that make sense? Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and maybe that's the ascesis. I don't know, that I may not feel like it, but I know how to pause and to stop and to respond in a loving manner. And I guess that in itself is love. And part of my prayer, I guess, is that my heart will become more loving so that the feeling of love is there, and it's not always, it becomes more of a way of being, as opposed to I always have to stop and pause and respond.
Yeah, thanks, Mary Sue. A few comments to that. You really raised some nice points that are worth maybe pulling together. The whole expression "fake it till you make it" is kind of coming up, and I do think that there is a, as you say, an ascesis to acting loving even when I don't feel loving. And one of the things in my study of the Desert Mothers and Fathers that really comes through is their own practice of silence is multifaceted. And certainly, first and foremost, silence is worship for the mothers and fathers of the Egyptian desert. But it's also loving one another because they were profoundly aware of the capacity for words to hurt, for gossip to break down relationships, for backstabbing to destroy community. And so we can be certain that living for so long in such close proximity, they often had ill feelings toward one another for God knows what political reasons, or, interpersonal relationships or chemistry. But they practiced, in a sense, the silence as a way of faking it, until they made it, kind of thing. This is what you're saying, that in many ways, the capacity to demonstrate or restraint is a loving act in itself, because once that word is out, once you retaliate verbally or otherwise, you've now deepened the problem, and you've widened the fracture, and you've created a longer, more complex history. And as we know, one of the ways that the Orthodox Christians speak of original sin is not, as Augustine would, as a spot on the soul that the waters of baptism have to wash away, but as a deficit, a glass that should be full is half empty, and the waters of baptism kind of fill that to the brim. That sin becomes, in some senses, a something that should be there that isn't, a deficit in that way. And I think that's helpful, because essentially the way that gets played out is we are all born into a world in which, as we've learned tragically this past week, it takes 9 months to give birth to a child and an instant to destroy that life. It takes, years to build a loving relationship, and, one infraction that could destroy it forever. It takes years to build skyscrapers and an hour to take 2 of them down with our airplane. So we understand that we're living in a world in which there is an ease with which destruction and hurt and woundedness can happen, and a world in which it's very difficult to repair and make up for and kind of amend those things. And that's what I think Orthodox are somehow sociologically speaking to around this question of original sin as a deficit. We're born into a broken world. We're influenced by that brokenness, and we then, willingly or not, end up participating in that. And the very intentional community that was the Desert Mothers and Fathers, I think, really tried to embody as best as possible the kingdom. And that meant that, their silence was born of a loving, caring, indeed ascetical commitment to one another, instead of that biting word or that sharp comeback or that insult that they knew could easily have deteriorated the community. So I do think there's tremendous value in that. We shouldn't associate love with a feeling, but really with a commitment and an embodiment, despite our feelings sometimes, to build community, to refrain from harm, and thereby to create a better good, right? The less harm we do, the less there is to have to repair for that harm. So I think that you're spot on. And what I found so moving about Thurman's reflections in this case was, I feel like he was expressing what's going on interiorly to what I was trying to describe exteriorly, that don't let that word sting me to the point where I want to retaliate. Let me let go of that in my heart. That's where the practice comes in. And even if you're still struggling with the sting and you can't quite let it go, not to respond to it becomes a dying to it on some level that gives birth to a more intimate relationship that you're not chipping away at, eroding. So there's something very positive that comes out through not only my actions, but my refraining from certain actions that would otherwise harm them. So I hope that helps connect some of those dots. Yeah. Thanks, Mary Sue. Penny, good morning.
Hello, everyone. It's so nice to be back with you. This last paragraph, I've been gone for 3 weeks, a lot of traveling, and this sense of crowded subways, very stressful airports, train stations, handling my bag, just moving about. And one of the experiences I had was the sense of not wanting to get caught up in a sense of stress and not observe what other people are going through, because it's so easy to just focus on oneself. There was my last time in Lindisfarne, I was by myself, went to dinner in a little pub my last evening, packed, absolutely packed with people. These two waiters, young women who were handling all this so brilliantly. And as I waited, I thought, well, there's one thing I could do, which is to feel frustrated that my food hadn't come. It was late. I mean, it was long lines, and yet they were handling everything. And I looked at the two of them as they were observing everybody's table and working so hard to keep things flowing. And at the end of the meal, I said, it's been a wonderful food, but most wonderful is to watch how you two work together. You are the most beautiful team. And they smiled. It was such a gift to them. And I thought, if I had been with somebody else, not observant of where they were and how they were doing it and how they were handling it, I would never have made that comment. And I suddenly realized that it's the silence, in being silent to myself and just really watching and looking at where other people are and what's going on, that if we allow ourselves that silence, we can find a way to give something back to other people. And they were so profoundly grateful. It was the end of a long shift for them, and they smiled and they said, sometimes people mix us up. One of us is Zoe and the other one of us is Sophie. And so, but it taught me something, that how to find peace in all of this craziness that we sometimes go through is to stop our own internal chatter and just look and watch other people. And then you find a way to give back.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Penny, it's beautiful. In many ways, it's a metaphor, one might say, for the whole ascetical life or the whole Christian life, because, the thing I think that ascesis helps teach us is to let go of the wants and desires that we have, which in this case is metaphorized by your meal that was clearly delayed because of the hustle and bustle of the crowded pub. And the growing frustration that comes when I don't get what I want, or I have some goal that I'm trying to achieve and it's being frustrated by this person or that event or the flat tire or whatever. And you have to kind of let go of the reaction of the frustration around the service that isn't efficient and the cooks that aren't cooking quickly enough and the crowds that are frustrating you, in order then to step back from your own desires, wants, and needs, to then begin to observe, who are the servers, and what are they up against in this very crowded place? I've always wanted to get a bumper sticker that says, to everybody else, you're the traffic, because it helps kind of put into perspective. We think of, in our own self-centered world, everybody else is the problem who's on the road, but we're that problem to every other car on the road. We're part of that problem to them. So in a sense, it's a beautiful metaphor for there's a desire and a want. I'm hungry. I want this food to come out. I have somewhere to be, and I'm going to let go of that so that I can look more compassionately at those who are working so hard to bring me what I'm looking for. It's a very lovely story. Nice parable there. Thank you. Kathleen, good morning.
Good morning. This morning I read a little bit about Therese of Lisieux, and she told the story of being in the laundry, and the sister next to her was splashing dirty water in her face as she was working. Her first reaction, of course, was to resist that, name that, but she was silent. And through that silence, she transitioned to a place of love, of being with God in love. And so it was so delightful for her that every day she would rush back to be in that situation where she would be splashed. So I just think how counter that is to my reactions.
Yeah, right. And it's beautiful because with that comes a tremendous freedom, doesn't it? Instead of rejecting or resisting or pushing the experience away, you dive into it and transform the way you experience it. And that really is so much too, I think, what goes into the practice both of prayer but of asceticism is checking or observing or noticing the narratives we build around experiences. And that's where many a wise mentor in the spiritual life will tell you is where suffering gets introduced. It's not so much what's happening, it's your narrative around what's happening that causes the suffering. And this is why I think there is so much, for example, hostility on our roadways, because you can't communicate. When you're passing with someone on the street, and they bump into you, you can see immediately from their expression or their reaction, like, oh, excuse me, or I'm sorry, that this was unintended, not hostile, a genuine, mistake. And it doesn't even really register as much. But when somebody makes a mistake and cuts you off in the car or does something that you interpret as rude or dangerous, most often our go-to is, that was aggressive, that was rude, that was, bad driving, as opposed to that person just made an honest mistake. And so because of the distance between me and that individual in our, 2,000-ton vehicles careening down the highway at 60 miles an hour, that distance between us doesn't allow for the nuance of communication for me to recognize, oh, that was just an honest mistake, or they just didn't see me, or whatever. They got momentarily distracted. So my response is anger, hostility, defensiveness, even though if that same person had sort of done that in body, would have been like, oh, no problem. So why is our go-to always one of that jerk or, that person who is, doing this irresponsible thing versus they just made an honest mistake? So it's the narrative around what they did that begins to create the anger more so than the intentions of what they did. And I think those things are thwarted when we have that communication or that direct experience of someone. And I think the experience that she's talking about of moving into it and wanting to sort of re-experience that is a way of letting go of her initial narrative of this is irritating, this is hostile, or, and reframing that in a very different way. Thank you. Sylvia, please.
Good morning. It's wonderful to be back. And like Penny, I too was with my family back east for almost 2 weeks after not having seen them for almost 3 years. And it was just challenging. It's a huge amount of things to be accomplished and work and finishing my mother's taxes and finishing the remodeling of her home and renting it and get everything. And anyway, there's a long list of things, but my intent was to do exactly what you've been talking about in the book in this section. And I actually, I didn't have any more room in my suitcase, so I photographed pages from the book and had them in my phone and some of the prayers. And I would excuse myself to go to the bathroom, and I'd bring my phone and, okay, I can do this. I can do this. And so I was successful. I never retorted back. I was kind and loving and generous and patient and quiet throughout the entire time. But it was turmoil in my heart, and painful and sad. And I would go back to where I was staying and cry every night. But when I got back a few days ago, I was sitting in meditation, and once in a while, as I've shared in this group before, once in a while, a vision or a teaching will just descend into my being when I'm quiet and still and empty. And the one from a few days ago was so beautiful. And it's not that it's anything that we don't know, but it was the experience and what descended into my, or ascended or showed up, whatever words we want to use, was I felt the just sudden presence of the divine saturating everything in me and where I was sitting, everything that, and it wasn't that it was showing up, it was that the veil between my awareness of it had dissolved in that moment. And I received just literal instruction to take the practice on of realizing that every single pair of eyes that I ever encounter, birds, insects, humans, dogs, cats, everything, that if I simply practice what I'm being given and look just a millimeter behind the surface of the eye, I will see God looking back, regardless of how they're behaving, regardless of the circumstances, regardless of how it's affecting me emotionally or physically on any level. But every pair of eyes is a window into the divine. And all I have to do is remember this and meet it and go past the surface. And I had the experience then of this quick, like a video film stills going by of dog eyes and raccoon eyes and my mother and my brother and people on the street and people who are behaving horribly, doing some of the heinous things that we all see in the news. And it was just, there it is. I don't
Thank
have
you.
any.
You know, it's really a beautiful experience. And I think you're right. There's how we think about, for example, the face of Christ as hiding or revealing the divine. And as you talk about eyes, the same question sort of comes up. You know, do the eyes become a mask through which the divine shines, or do they actually reveal the divine? And I think, you know, where you would come down on that, and I would agree with you that, you know, this is what reveals the divine in all of us. And it's beautiful when you can see through that millimeter of the veneer and experience the beauty and the divinity of that. Thomas Merton always says, in the spiritual life, we always come to know things by experience. And that's very different than conceptualizing these ideas, but knowing them in your heart, which sounds to me like you had a beautiful insight into that. Thank you. Yeah. Welcome back, Sylvia. Other thoughts this morning? Rosemary, I see your hand over there. Go right ahead. It's been a while. It's nice to hear from you again. Just you want to make sure you unmute there.
What has helped me in my life is in loving others is, first of all, is recognizing, being aware and self-discipline. By that, I mean that when I reacted or became irritated, I would go over it and meditate about it. And then I would name it. Why did it happen? And so I would name it and then acclaim it and then take it to the Lord and pray about it, how to and ask the Lord to help me how to deal with this irritation or with my reactions. And that has helped me very, very much. And also to recognize that we're all loved by God, and God shows no partiality. And the indwelling of the Spirit is within each of us. And so, regardless of what people may do, it's always, I've recognized God loves them, and to see the love of Christ in each individual. And that also is very helpful, because we have to love everyone, even Putin, but we don't love their actions. We don't like their actions. We love everyone, but we don't like their actions. And that is a big help in dealing with people and knowing how to respond. That has helped me very much in my life.
Thanks, Rosemary. I have a parishioner here who always, in situations like that, just says, Vincent, just lay it at the foot of the cross. You just lay that at the foot of the cross. And in a sense, that's what I'm hearing from you is a similar sort of approach. And I think that the beauty of both the life of prayer and the ascetical life, that if I can maybe frame your own way of sort of approaching this, is to basically, the question becomes not as much about me loving, but is about me allowing Christ to love through me. And therefore to, as Paul would say, to die to those things that are other than love, essentially. So by not feeling, in a sense, the need to have to like someone, but to love them anyway, is a sense, yeah, putting your own judgments aside to allow the love of Christ to come through you. And that really is a way in which we cooperate, if you want to say, with this whole, the beauty of deification, the beauty of the fact that we are members of Christ's body, and that the best thing we can do is to get out of the way so Christ can continue to love.
That's true.
So thank you for that, Rosemary. It's a beautiful approach to that. So I wonder if maybe, unless somebody has some further comments, I don't want to cut anyone off, but we can look at the practice upcoming and discuss a little bit of the practice that we had 2 weeks ago, although you may have forgotten it by now. Let me just call that up in a moment here. Oh, Gerald, go right ahead before I go ahead and do that. I see your hand. Good to see you.
Good to see you. These long breaks are tough. I don't want to get us off track. And many wonderful experience of ascesis in our daily lives have been shared. But I wonder about taking it to another or a different level in terms of how we relate to the unjustified acts of others. For example, the incursion of Russia into Ukraine, the situation in Uvalde, the hospital situation, the environment. I just read that the amount of carbon dioxide has far exceeded expectations in previous years. In addition, a study out of the United Kingdom shows that there's 2,000 times more toxins and carcinogens released from the rubber and the compounds that are released from the tires on an automobile than from the exhaust pipe. We've done such a good job on the exhaust pipe. We haven't paid any attention. There are no regulations involving tires. But anyway, is there something related to our personal ascesis that we should be taking into some of these other areas? At some point, we have to, I don't know, draw the line, put our foot down. Enough is enough. Well, let me use the tires as an example. We focused, we did studies, we found out about carbon and the dangers and so forth. And the study out of the United Kingdom is fairly new. I don't think it's even been peer reviewed, but I'm sure we're going to hear much more about that. But prior to that, we didn't know. And now we have to address that. I don't want to see us forgetting about these other issues, these bigger overarching, well, I won't say bigger. I mean, it starts with my neighbor. Anyway, I don't know if I'm making myself clear, but I feel a frustration there. Anything you can share on that?
Sure, Joe. Well, I will say this, that, in this book, and perhaps more than anywhere in this chapter, and I suppose to some degree in the last chapter, which follows, I am trying to address these types of questions. So I didn't know it until the book was published, but since then, a lot of the feedback I've gotten on it has been that the modern lay contemplative Christian movement has so far centered around sitting and silence, which is, of course, an appropriate, good, and right place to explore and to encourage and so forth, and to put into practice. But what a lot of people have said to me at conferences or presentations or on retreats is that a lot of what I'm trying to say here feels like a next step that a lot of people have been kind of wondering about, which I think addresses your question. So what next? So we're learning how to sit in silence, and we're learning how to be quiet and to listen and to all of those things. But what do we do with that as people who are in the world? What does it matter in terms of my social engagement or my Christian discipleship that I'm practicing a life of contemplation versus not? And it is a specifically valuable question for those of us who are not monks, but who are living in the world and therefore engaging in these issues that all of which you've raised and all of which are profoundly disturbing. And I agree with you. And I think this chapter was, on one hand, an attempt to introduce what I thought was more or less an absence, by and large, in modern Christian contemplative circles around the connection between prayer and asceticism. It's just almost fallen off the radar. Father Keating does have what he calls a welcoming prayer that he introduced, which really is an act of a practice of asceticism. But I didn't see a theology of asceticism being developed the way I saw a theology of prayer being developed. And that's what this chapter tried to address, or take a little foray into that question. And then the last chapter, Becoming Prayer, really looks at, again, how we embody prayer as people who are actively engaged in the world. And so I see that as flowing out of this chapter. The short answer then is, I think that we, as people who are feeling called to live a contemplative life, must be asking collectively the questions you're asking. What difference does it make? What do we do with the commitment to silence? How do we embody that in a way that begins to impact our own being in the world as disciples? And I certainly don't claim that this book answers those questions, but it does, I think, try to grapple honestly with those, and to provide an entryway or foray into exploring that question. Many, if not all, of the problems you just raised are well beyond any individual to alter or change the course of. As you'll see in the last bit of this chapter on keeping vigil, the very last paragraph of this book was an edited version of a letter I sent to my community right after Sandy Hook, and reworked it again to send out to St. Columba's after Uvalde. If you look at the last paragraph of this chapter, you'll see that very clearly. And in many ways, that becomes the first step, is to keep vigil, to not flinch, and to then ask, in this world of so much chaos, so much suffering, so much corruption, so much environmental degradation, what can I do from my place of listening, like sort of what Sylvia was talking about, or even Penny, when I look past the hustle and bustle, when I look past the veneer of the eye, when I sit long enough to observe the waitresses, the eyes of these various creatures, and see something different, the next question is, so now what? What does that lead us to in our own way? And as I've said, and will say again, there are those extremes that we have to avoid: being paralyzed from being so overwhelmed, and then on the other hand, feeling that we personally have to resolve every crisis that the world is confronting. So, my formula is, you can't do nothing, you can't do everything, but you must do something. And each of us has to determine what that something is. And that will be deeply informed by literally where we live in the world, what our local community is, where we're being called passionately to address something or other, trusting that as one member on the body of Christ, other members are being summoned to their participation in providing, responses to these various crises. But we do that not in isolation. We do that in a way in which we recognize that I'm doing my part. And trusting that members of Christ's body are doing their part, and that we are on the same team, if you want to say, even if we're doing very different work in the world. If we're working toward eco-justice, social justice, if we're working with, raising awareness about Ukraine or gun control and so forth, we're doing our part. And I would just encourage you, and I speak autobiographically here, not to become so overwhelmed as to start to feel paralyzed, which is something I grapple with almost on a daily basis. It's it's dizzying to see what is happening in the world on so many levels that sometimes it's difficult to find that thread of hope. But as I said in my sermon to my community last Sunday, I had written a sermon that I realized an hour before Mass I couldn't deliver. And that's the first time that happened to me in 5.5 years. It was about Uvalde, and it was an angry tirade of judgment and condemnation toward the NRA and so forth and so on. And I realized I wrote it for myself, but it wasn't going to advance the community. It was just going to be a captive audience for me to rant about my rage and sadness and grief about what happened to these children that I'm still carrying very deeply. And it would have felt cathartic for me, but certainly wasn't going to bring the community to a different place or advance us in response or prayer. And I realized at the last minute I had to drop that and then open up instead the conversation to my congregation, both in person and online. And I hope not to have to repeat that often, because I take deep responsibility in trying to provide a thoughtful sermon to my congregation on a weekly basis. And I felt like I was sort of kicking the can down the road and putting it on them in a sense, but trying to hold the space because I had nothing to say in my despair around this. So I think that while we can all easily be tempted toward rage and anger and insult around the way the world is going, and some of that is quite righteous, how do we cultivate that energy in prayer, in solidarity, and in a particular direction that embodies something I can do and leave the body of Christ elsewhere to be addressing these in other ways? And unfortunately, I don't know if I have at this point in my life a better response than that, avoiding those extremes and committing to something, but do commit to something. We need that. So thank you for the question, Gerald. And I don't know how satisfying that response was, but I appreciate your questioning.
Yes, thank you. I have to admit, I don't feel satisfied at the moment, but I agree with everything you said.
Yeah, I know what you mean.
So much can be said. And I guess in a way, I don't ever want to really be, I don't ever want to be satisfied if that means I'm comfortable. It just leaves a lot of questions. It
does.
I don't know, a broken heart. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, Gerald, as we get to the final section of this chapter, you'll see it's exactly a broken heart that is the practice right now, to hold that. It's a tough place to be. Tita, good morning or good afternoon. Not sure what time zone you're in, but welcome.
It's morning here.
Okay.
So thank you. And good morning to you as well, and to each online here today. So more of a question than an actual statement of any kind. Oh, when you were reading the last portion of what you read, I thought I heard the echo of a small song, not actually a hymn, but I thought I heard the echo in the wording of a hymn, and of a song, and I was trying to recall to mind what that was, what the actual song was. And I wondered if that was in your mind when you wrote that, the echo to the phrasing of a song.
Oh, you mean when I wrote what I read today from Contemplating Christ? To my knowledge, no, I don't know of a hymn that I was thinking of when I wrote that. But if you could pinpoint at some point for me, even if you want to email me, I could certainly try to see if there's a connection there of something I know. Steve is suggesting I want Jesus to walk with me. I have to confess, I don't know the lyrics of that. So if there is a resonance, it would be coincidental. But, again, I've written that now. This was written many years ago now, 4 or 5 years ago, I guess, by the time I was writing this. So I don't recall if I had something in mind, but it's interesting that you would hear that in there.
a song more than a hymn, but very a sweetness to it. So I mean, it was a good echo. So
Nice. Okay, good. I'm
I'll
glad
try
to.
to pinpoint that and find the words. That was in my mind to find the words to the actual song. So
Okay. Sure, of course. Thanks. So let me go ahead and call up then our presentation here again, and just so as a practice, my suggestion is that we sit with the desire to be more loving and see what arises. The question becomes more loving to whom, in what way? And then I ask you to try it. A number of you brought out today, something that brings us beyond the theoretical into the practice. So what if you hold as your intention in prayer to be more loving? And then as you're holding that broad sort of sense of just to be loving, who or what is coming or presenting themselves as the one who is seeking that love or who needs that love from you, and then jump in and see what happens. So that's based as much on what I wrote as what Howard Thurman reflected on in his own Meditations of the Heart. And then our final, if there's anybody, I know, again, it's a while ago now, but for last week's or several weeks ago practice, I invited you to consider the lilies and notice the presence of nature in every part of your world. What does it teach you about your cares? This is, of course, drawn from the passage in Luke about consider the lilies as a way of freeing ourselves from care. What does it teach you about your own cares? And Kathy, I could always rely on you, Kathy, to do my practices. Thank you for that. I'm honored by that. Go right ahead.
Okay, so no, this practice has been very much with me the past couple of weeks. So I live in a suburb east of Seattle and developed well over half a century ago. And thankfully, the developers left a lot of the tall native conifer trees here when they built all the houses. So a few days into doing this practice, we had a 2-day windstorm with 2 days of sustained winds between 20 and 40 miles an hour. So, and I walk every day, and I walk pretty much the same path through the neighborhood. I've been doing it for over 18 years because it includes some significant hill work, which I like. And so on the first day of the windstorm walking, the trees, the conifer trees, the branches were going wild. And this time of year, the new growth, so the branches themselves, the needles are very dark green, but the new growth is this intense chartreuse, bright green. And so with all the conifer branches just waving, and these are tall conifers, all of a sudden the fragment from Isaiah 55:12 came to mind. All the trees of the field will clap their hands. And so that's what and I've known, this, the stones talking, the trees clapping their hands. I mean, I love those words from the Bible, but all of a sudden, every cell of my body was experiencing the presence of God and praising God, and with the trees clapping their hands. And it just lifted me up in such a spirit of joy. And then to get a second day of that was wonderful. So now, subsequently, my daily walks, the trees are very silent, but there's a vibrancy now as I walk those paths that I don't think will ever go away. But the vibrancy isn't just now when I walk, but it's present, it's in every cell of my being. And this has become particularly important for me because I have been dealing with complex PTSD for decades, and it's been particularly painful the past few weeks. And I mean, to the point where it's really difficult some days to hold that intense pain.
but the gift of having this, the praise, the vibrancy and the greater knowing of presence within which to provide me a greater context within which to hold this pain has been such a gift. And so I thank you for this practice, because I don't think, had I not been carrying that with me and then open to the gift that the windstorms and the trees brought me, that I would have what I've been praying for, is just a way to be able to continue to walk this healing path in a way that ultimately, hopefully, I can be of service to others.
That's beautiful, Kathy. Thank you. Yeah, I love those sort of anthropomorphized images of nature, clapping hands and stone shouting and so forth. It is quite beautiful, and it connects us on a very real level to the reality of the being of all of these beautiful dimensions of creation. And it's a beautiful practice. So thank you for sharing that. It brings me great joy to hear that sort of moved you in that place of gratitude. So thank you. Very nice. Elizabeth, good morning.
Hi, good morning, everybody. This time of year in North Carolina, daylilies are blooming everywhere. So when I'm walking, I stop pretty much every time I see one. I try not to do that when I'm driving, because then I become the traffic. But these daylilies really remind me of what we've been talking about with our Christian community, and how each of us can do something, though none of us can do everything, because these daylilies are all over the place. But from their name, as you know, they only bloom for a day. And so it's the tiniest life, but it makes such a difference collectively. So that's the lilies have literally been in my life lately. And I just wanted to say one other thing. The last time we met, and I cried the whole time that I talked, I wanted to thank you for your prayers for me, for our dog Biscuit. She transitioned the Monday after we met, and it was very peaceful. So I truly appreciate your prayers. Thank you.
Yeah, Elizabeth, as a dog lover, I'm just so sorry to hear that. In fact, the very day that I discovered my dog Forrest at our college campus, the kids conspired with a local adoption agency to bring puppies on campus at the end of the semester so kids could pet them to soothe themselves for exam week. And that's how I encountered him. And I literally picked up this little 11-week-old puppy. He put his head against my chest and looked up at me. And literally the first words out of my mouth were, "Someday you're going to break my heart." And I know that day is coming. And there's just so much love in the meantime that keeps me so present, because I know how fleeting, like those daylilies, the life of a dog can seem to us, in their mere 14 or so years. But my heart goes out to you. I know that it's not, people can often be insensitive to how painful it can be to lose such a close furry companion. So I'm very sorry, and happy to know that it was a peaceful transition. It's beautiful.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody.
So we're coming up close to 8:30, and unless there was some other sharing that somebody's just dying to get out there. Okay. So let me ask if you would to keep St. Columba's in prayer this weekend. We are on this Feast of Pentecost consecrating our bell that will be put up in a new tower on our roof on June 9th. Interestingly enough, it was my desire to have the bell tower put up for the first Sunday of Advent last November. So see how far that got us. And then when we blew past that, I insisted that they were ringing for Holy Week. That never happened. And after all is said and done, the date turns out where everything conspired on June 9th, which happens to be the Feast of St. Columba. So it tells you who's in charge here, certainly not me. So we are delighted for this time to be raising this bell. And just to, my sermon this coming Sunday will be about the history and theology of this tower. And we just had a local newspaper article and photo come out. I'll send it to Joanne, and if anybody's interested, you can kind of read a bit about it. But the bell itself is dedicated to my father, who passed away in November of 19, and we'll be consecrating that bell on Sunday after Mass. Actually, it's also going to be hybrid Zoom if anybody wanted to be there for that. But it's a beautiful time for us as a community in anticipation of, this coming week when everything is going to get raised. And the original bell was made of steel, and it was about 35 pounds. And this is a poured bronze bell, and it's 650 pounds. So you can imagine it's a bit of an upgrade from what I used to call my Campbell's soup can on the roof there. So we're looking forward to a time when this bell will call us to prayer and worship and the Angelus and mark the passing through across the veil and the joining of hands in marriage and all of that. So it's going to be hopefully a wonderful feature, and ask you to keep us all in prayer as we transition into that. So I want to thank you all for being here. I've missed you all. It's been two weeks of absence, feels like forever. So it's good to be back, and I'm very much looking forward to seeing you a week from today. So God bless you, and go with my blessing in the name of the 3 in 1 and 1 in 3 and Benum Christ in it. I greet Christ in you. Have a lovely week, and I'll see you soon.